I wanted to welcome you to this brown bag, which is co-sponsored by Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution undergraduate program, the Middle East Studies program, Global Islamic Studies, the Center for Global Studies, and the Department of Public and International Affairs. And we're thrilled that we could pull this together pretty quickly. Bassam Haddad, who is the director of the Middle East Studies program, will talk today about the events unfolding in the Middle East right now. Bassam teaches also in the Public and International Affairs here at George Mason and is the editor of Arab Studies Journal. He also has directed an award-winning documentary film about Baghdad and has done lots of other really fascinating things. So we're thrilled that he was able to come and give this talk today. And I do hope we resolve our technical difficulties because I know he has incredible images to share with everybody from the Middle East. So
I am happy we are here, and I'm astounded by the turnout. So I'm glad you guys are plugged in and interested. I would like for this to be more of a conversation based on a back and forth. So I will not be sitting here talking for very long at all. I would like to introduce the topic in a particular way, as you will see, and then talk about the basics that have been happening in Egypt and Tunisia, specifically Egypt. And then I would like to open it up to a back and forth, and I would like people from the audience as well to participate, because we cannot pretend that I know everything, and we cannot pretend that you are just here to listen. I would like you to be a part of this, which is not, the setup is not conducive to this, but we will make the best of it. The flyer says, "and turmoil in Lebanon," and that refers to the international tribunal that is expected to indict Hezbollah, and how this has created issues in Lebanon that led to the withdrawal of Hezbollah and their allies, the Free Patriotic Movement, from the government, which caused the government to fall, and a new government to be established that is actually led by the opposition, which withdrew from the government because they were not the majority, and now they are the majority, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to talk about this very much, unless people have questions. I just wanted to address the idea, because when we were talking about the events, they didn't escalate to the level they are today in Egypt. So Lebanon will be sort of on the side if you want to discuss it. So we're not just doing false advertising. I'm just trying to be straightforward with you. There are at least two ways to talk about the events in Tunisia and Egypt. First, the healthy way, where we discuss the causes that have been percolating for a very long time now in both countries, and the triggers that ignited the uprisings, and where things seem to be headed. Essentially, this is the more social scientific way of talking about what's happening. The other way to talk about the events in Egypt, more so than Tunisia, because this is what I'll be talking about, is what we might call the necessary way. Here, before we talk about the uprising and its causes, we must address the dominant viewpoint in the mainstream media and beyond, in the circles we exist here. By and large, how in the mainstream media, the dominant view, how it focuses almost exclusively, but in any case excessively, on culture and Islam, and trying to make sense of what is happening in Egypt and Tunisia and the rest of the Arab world. In a nutshell, one has to address what we call culture talk. In my class on authoritarianism in the Middle East right now, we've talked about culture talk a little bit, and I'll start briefly with the second way, the necessary way, which is actually something that we have to do, not because we want to understand the revolution, but it's important to unlearn a little bit some of the things through which we see the events in the region. I'll start briefly with that because it's necessary in an environment where the dominant explanatory trend, even at the level of academia and analysts and pundits and experts, where the dominant explanatory trend keeps bringing us back to culture and religion at the expense of other factors that have played a major role in the Tunisian and Egyptian revolts or uprisings. It's not that they don't matter, it's just that there are many other factors, and it's the other factors that actually weigh quite heavily. Culture talk is the idea that every polity has a cultural essence that defines it and determines its prospects in an almost tangible way. So culture, or in this case Islam, becomes a sufficient variable in explaining the causes of the revolution as well as our fear of the revolution, both of which are actually unfounded. These revolutions, revolts, uprisings, protests, whatever you want to call them, are not about culture or Islam. Islamists played a minor role, if at all. Culture talk, these revolutions are not about culture and Islam. Islam has played actually a quite minor role, if at all, in much of this. Certainly in Tunisia, as a trigger. And there will not be an Islamist takeover. And if Islamists or the Muslim Brotherhood play a role down the road in a better form of government, it will be akin to that played by the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, not like the Taliban in Afghanistan. But even that is not on the table right now in any case. So it's really important. I cannot go through the history to explain how significant it is to just recognize that, because a lot of the analysis is driven by this conviction, and it's almost impossible to shake off. After millions and millions of people are on the streets, none of them producing sectarian slogans or anything of the sort that have to do with a particular religion or a particular framework or platform, we insist on the lens that we are most familiar with. It's kind of like the Jew in the apartment building in Nazi times, who is a really nice guy, but his neighbor, a member of the Nazi party, is bewildered, and then they keep trying to figure out why is this person such, at the same time that my party presents the Jews as the culprits, and there's volumes about how these people are and so on and so forth, and what their nature is and so on. Culture talk. So he goes to the Nazi party. Oh, thank you. Do you want to check it out? Because this way I can do an intro and then we can do the images as well. Thank you. So he goes to the Nazi party and asks them, what's going on? I have this Jew who is a neighbor, and he's fantastic. He's a great person in all ways. Just normal, actually. How should I treat this given what you tell me? And then the party person told him, well, that's precisely the point. They are very nice to you in the beginning so they can gain your trust, and then they're going to stab you in the back. That discourse was convincing. And it's precisely, if you make some adjustments, it's precisely what is happening today. We are so convinced of something that nothing, even millions of people, more than 20 to 30 million people are on the streets, were on the streets in the past 2 weeks. It doesn't matter. Matters nothing. What matters for the dominant mainstream view is these convictions. And they are being chipped at, and a lot of people are beginning to rethink what is happening based on what they see on the ground. But it continues to be a struggle. It doesn't mean that these people are angels. Trust me, Egyptians are not angels. Tunisians are not angels. And you know more than I do that we are not angels in this country either. There's no such thing, right? They're just human beings responding to stimuli, right? And being conditioned over years and years in particular ways, and they adapt. And if you put them in a better system, they adapt. When they come here, these people, the Muslims or the Arabs, they adapt. And when we go there, under a system that is a little different, we adapt. But there's nothing in the nature and the cultural nature of people that is essentially that different in terms of calling for democracy and freedom. We used to say this in classes, just to say it. Now, it's like on the screen. And still, people are unmoved. A colleague of mine, I don't know if he is here, just forwarded me yesterday an article by another professor from another university who finally found the solution. And the article was supposedly by this Egyptian guy, which is, apparently if it's an Egyptian, they know everything, who's writing in the most culturalist manner I've ever read, talking about Egyptians' belief in charts and how that is problematic for a polity that wants to move to democracy, or belief in something like that, that in the newspapers, it was all over the newspapers a few weeks ago. And how do we expect a people like that, for instance, who have this, and then he counted other beliefs, to move to democracy? And it's interesting that this becomes more important than the millions of people on the streets. And that is not their problem, that's ours. But that's besides the point. So these revolutions are not about culture of any sort, not just about Islam, it's a culture of any sort, Arabism and so on. But the insistence on this point, on culture talk, even in parts of academia, major parts very close to the halls of power, and despite evidence and everyday developments to the contrary, speaks to what we can call theologocentrism. Theologocentrism is that school of thought that attributes all observable phenomenon to matters in religious texts or in religion. Theologocentrism is the dominant view with which we explain the Middle East. Mish means not in Arabic, sorry. Not all of us, not those people I'm going to talk about at all times, but it's the dominant view. A dominant view doesn't mean everyone's doing it at all times. It means that it's the default. If you don't know the details about something, you hear of a bit of news, you go to the default. Just like many of us do on subjects that we are either not very informed about or misinformed about. So theologocentrism is a dominant view. And it actually is interesting that if you follow the past 30 years, the major events, you begin to realize how problematic this view is, because it was applied even when actors had nothing to do with culture or religion. In fact, they were anti-religion. They were putting Islamists in concentration camps and burning them in acid, right? And still, we attributed causes of certain things to Islam, even in that case. For instance, the person I'm talking about, of course, is our friend who's dead now, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein in 1990 invaded Kuwait, August 1990. And within weeks or months, the bestseller on the New York bestsellers list in the United States, New York Times, was what? The Quran. There's no propaganda of sorts necessarily here telling people to go buy the Quran, but most people started buying the Quran to explain and to find out why Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. A person that is the arch enemy of Islamists, who imprisoned Islamists, who's anti-Islamist, who himself is not a practitioner. Of course, he became later in the 1990s to piss us off and to bring the Islamists on his side after we dropped him as a friend. But at the time, it had nothing to do with that. Yet, the Quran, I wish it was like some sheikh or imam who just produced a manual or a book in the 80s that Saddam Hussein was influenced by. It was the Quran that he was influenced by, according to a lot of people. And that statistic, if you look at the Pew Research Center from 30 years until today, holds that even before September 11th, that people are motivated by religion. And this is the most significant obstacle that we need to get over in order to do social science. This is not about, dogma or ignoring the role of religion or culture. This is simply an impediment that needs to be dealt with adequately in a sound, level-headed manner before we start doing social science, before we start explaining anything. And I wanted to start with this so that when we talk about things, we have this in mind, we can still ask questions about it and interrogate it. I don't assume that what I said right now should erase all kinds of convictions. After all, I might be wrong. I might be overstating the case. But we can no longer take it for granted. That's what explains action. What we said? If I lose my voice, I'll be fine. So instead, let's look at the history that led to the uprisings. I will not talk very much, as I shared with you, because I really would like to have you get involved in asking questions and in talking with each other, and I'm happy to also address your concerns. But I would like to address the major areas that help us explain and make sense of what is happening. Major areas. I'm not talking about factors yet. This is not the time to talk about factors in a discrete social scientific way. But the major areas that we must address in order to make sense of what is happening on the ground in Egypt and Tunisia and in the rest of the Arab world. Note that the protests did not just erupt in Tunisia and Egypt. They also erupted in Morocco, in Jordan, in Yemen, and it's likely for this to continue because of these factors that are structural. Let me start with, let me just skip some of the pontifications and just get to the factors. First, there is a long-standing, or there has been a long-standing process of economic deterioration in terms of living standards, jobs, subsidies, food prices, etc. in the entire region. After decades of most of the public relying on the distributive state, the state that distributes welfare that has become more like an entitlement to people for decades, beginning in the 70s and 80s in Egypt and 80s and 90s in other parts of the Arab world, began to be scaled back. The distributive state began to scale back, and a new form of either leadership or alliances started being established between the state actually and other players, namely business. Okay, to reduce the category to business, but it's basically more of a different set of alliances that moved away from labor. So that has characterized the general history in the region in the past few decades. So people that could live on a salary, on a state salary, in the 1970s, because they have free education, free healthcare, and they were able to buy their food needs because of subsidies. Oil was subsidized, energy was subsidized. Today can no longer survive on their salary, and can no longer survive on their salary and another job, right? In Egypt, some of the state employees, we're talking about millions, because families depend on these people as well. Some receive 110 to 120 Egyptian pounds a month, which is about $18. So of course these guys have other jobs. Other jobs will get them a few more hundred Egyptian pounds. So we're still, in many cases, about, less than $100 a month, which cannot feed a family. In the 70s, this was sufficient, but with the currency exchange, liberalization of currency exchange rates, the increase in food prices, the withdrawal of subsidies, this has become an issue beginning in the 1990s, but reaching an apex in Egypt in 2005. This has become an issue that can no longer be tolerated. So beginning in the early 2000s to 2005, this has become an intolerable issue. So as opposed to many people observing this, some of us who are following Egyptian politics were baffled. How can this continue? If you go to Egypt and you just any cursory observation in the early 2000s to 2005, you just wonder, how come people are not just going nuts? I almost became theologocentric for a minute, because I'm thinking, what's going on? And then you began to see in 2004, 2005, the proliferation of protests, mainly labor protests, of people that are not able to survive based on their salaries. Between 2005 and 2010, there were more than 6,500 to 7,000, depending on how you count and how you calculate those protests. About 6,000 protests, let's say, documented around Egypt. 6,000 protests in 5 years, mainly about living standards, about particular kinds of rights. Usually they're economic rights, but the political undertone of these economic demands began to increase beginning in 2006 after the Mahalla strike. The Mahalla strike was significant because it's basically a textiles factory in the we can say the rural areas or countryside that employs thousands of workers who just, stopped working precisely because of this dilemma, because of this crisis. It's just living standard crisis. It's more than living standard, its subsistence was no longer tenable. That began to increase the rate of protests in Egypt between 2006 until today. And then a series of small, I would say, events began to politicize the demands. And of course, in the first week of January, came the Tunisian situation. And Ben Ali was no longer just being opposed, he actually fled to Saudi Arabia, which speaks to the nature of authoritarian regimes in the region. For many, many years, we've been talking about the ferocity of authoritarian regimes, but the weakness of authoritarian regimes at the same time, which is a contrast. They're ferocious because they apply coercive mechanisms and they apply violence, but of course they also rule with, not just with violence, but with alliances and support from certain groups, domestically and internationally. But mainly they're ferocious and illegitimate, and that kind of juxtaposition is what explains their nature. Saddam Hussein was extremely stable, quote unquote, even under the sanctions that were the most devastating sanctions in human history, because he was able to siphon off what he needed to siphon off in order to stay in power and build 80 palaces in the 13 years of the most brutal sanctions that we and the UN applied on Iraqis, for which the Iraqis paid, not Saddam Hussein. But the moment the American army entered Baghdad on April 9th, 2003, the regime fell apart like a house of cards. And no one was fighting to defend the regime or to bring it back. People were fighting for Iraq, for whatever. And it disappeared just like that. Something that will not happen in any situation where there is a legitimacy for the leadership. Even in the eyes of its cronies. Even his cronies and immediate supporters and the beneficiaries of the regime did not fight for it, because their relationship with the regime was of material exchange for the most part. There was no legitimacy, there was no emotional identification with the leadership. Same thing with Ben Ali in Tunisia. Egypt is a little different. Egypt built relationship with society. State-society relations in Egypt are thicker than in both Tunisia and Iraq. So that is what is explaining what is happening, partly what explains what is happening today, right? Not wholly. I will get to that in a minute. So we are talking about a situation in Tunisia and Iraq in which the moment that there is a critical mass against the regime, either coercively or in terms of people's power, the army that was standing in front of the Tunisians, and the Tunisians were going like this, they were going like this in front of the rifles. The person holding the rifle, when he saw the hundreds of thousands of people, didn't fire. The moment that this soldier didn't fire, you knew that Tunisia fell apart. Many of us wrote about this before Ben Ali left. It became evident that this is the end. And that's precisely what ended up happening, because when he came out that night and said, "I got you," because I wrote about this myself. I was following the events minute by minute. And Ben Ali came out and said, "I got you. I understand your demands. I got you." He said it twice. "Fahmtkom. And we will do X, Y, Z. I will not run again for elections in 2013 or something like that. And we will sack some of these ministers, blah, blah, blah." The next day, the protests intensified because it became clear how brittle these regimes are once they are confronted by this kind of mass power, or in the Iraqi case, an invasion by the most powerful military in history, I guess, not on earth. They fell apart just like that. And it's very interesting how when this happens, it should cause us to recalculate a lot of things. Recalculate Why is it that we assumed that before Ben Ali fell, we assume that there's some sort of acquiescence in Arab Islamic culture vis-a-vis authoritarianism because there's deference to authority in the Quran and this verse and that verse and this person said that and people on the news were like cheering for Saddam Hussein. In reality, they were bussed in from the countryside by Saddam Hussein and given food in order to cheer, and CNN would say, well, yeah, but he's got some support, and they would show these images. But then when these people fall, it's like we don't really revisit some of these claims. It becomes like the Jew with the Nazi neighbor. We actually find other reasons to explain it. Oh, look at the chaos. Look at the chaos in Egypt right now. Look at the chaos in Tahrir Square. These are the people you want to lead a democracy. It becomes an issue about chaos in this organization and the lack of leadership and all kinds of things. And that's the advanced analysis. That's after we're done with the idea that the Taliban and the jihadists are going to take over in Egypt. We have calculated. We have actually amassed a number of quotes that we actually heard on television, and we documented them. We were going to do a top 10, but then we ended up, it's like now we have to do a top 1,000. The number one out of all of these was something on both CNN and Fox, but on Fox it was said in a more eloquent way, was the following. After the anchors were watching the demonstrations, it was said that the person said, quote unquote, I recorded it, democracy is over in Egypt, which alone gets the top number one. Democracy is over in Egypt. Now all of a sudden Egypt is democratic because the people don't want it and the people want something else that is actually not, quote unquote, in the interest of the traditional, policy of the United States historically. Because the people actually have demands that we kind of don't like. And they have nothing to do with Islam, by the way, and we'll get to those. But it was interesting that it was said that democracy is over in Egypt, the jihadists are now going to take over. So it was basically this binary bifurcation between either, dictators or Democrats, according to this anchor, and then on the other side, it could only be the jihadists or the Islamists or what have you. I mean, even Islamists was not mentioned. It was the jihadists, and we're going to have a Taliban style, that's the last part, Taliban style polity in Egypt.
Yeah.
Great. None of this is grounded in any analysis of these societies. So, see, these regimes are brittle, they're strong on the outside, but once you crack them, they fall apart like that. And you will see, and you can email me, if I don't, die because of lack of sleep, because I'm on Middle East time, you can email me in the next few years and tell me I was wrong. But you will see how brittle these regimes are, provided this last factor actually kicks in, which unfortunately it looks like it's not going to kick in, and I'll get to that in a second. My point is, ultimately, for the first point, is that the long-standing process of economic deterioration, which produces inequality and social polarization, is not enough to produce a mass mobilization or collective action on part of the masses. Yesterday we had a panel, which was planned many months ago, before I did not predict the revolution. It was titled Inequity and Development. Anybody attended the panel? Remember what we discussed yesterday? We basically discussed that it's not enough for inequality to produce revolution. Social scientifically, that's not what produces revolution. But inequality, if it reaches certain proportion, and if it it hits the lowest common denominator in society, it becomes a necessary, though insufficient, element to produce mass mobilization. And that element was there. And we can discuss to a great length what that meant in real life, in terms of the people's inability to actually survive on their salary. So we get to issues of malnutrition and dropping out of school to work, selling of livestock in order to survive, which means you have no means for living. People wonder, why did it take so long? Because by the time people started doing those things, they had something to sell. They had jewelry, they had livestock, they were able to actually get by. But a few years after that, people had very little to lose if they went to the streets, right? I mean, it's a calculus that we all actually engage in. It's not about whether we like the regime or not, an authoritarian regime. It's a calculus because, fortunately, people under authoritarian regimes are rational, so they calculate. Adam Jaworski, a political scientist in the 1980s, basically spoke of the importance of legitimacy, but he said it's not enough to have legitimacy, a lack of legitimacy to produce a change in government or in regime. You have to have illegitimacy for one reason or another, and then you have to have a preferred alternative that exists, an alternative center of power that is supported by the people. So lack of legitimacy is not enough. But in Egypt and Tunisia and the rest of the Arab world, and in many parts of the developing world that are still authoritarian, or they have authoritarian governments, although I put these in quotation marks, the alternative has not always been preferred. Some of the Islamist groups were very popular, but they were not preferred across the board by the public. And it differs in different countries. However, in Tunisia, the alternative to this leadership, given its lack of legitimacy, was actually the people on the street. And it's a smaller country. It had severed its relations with society to a large extent, did not have sufficient mediation between state and society, was not strategic as Egypt is, so it was left alone by the powers that be. Ben Ali used to go and almost sit on the lap of Jacques Chirac. I don't know about Sarkozy because Sarkozy is new, but sit in the lap of French powerful players and come back. When the people went on the streets, Sarkozy said, "I will not receive him in Paris." We kept saying, kept saying that, we need to ask both sides to stop the violence and kind of calm down, which is something that makes you want to hit your head on the wall. The people are rising because they're being shot at, and we still talk about cycle of violence, between, there are two parties, and these guys are violent, and these guys are violent. Why don't we stop the violence? There's no consideration of something called relations of power and its implications. When Ben Ali fell, however, the first statement was, we support the will of the people, of the Tunisian people, because he fell, he's gone. We didn't really support him to begin with in terms of support for his longevity or the longevity of the regime, because Tunis is Tunis. Egypt is a different case. If Egypt falls in the Arab world as a center, cultural, political, military, and strategic, the entire balance of power in the region will change. And the change in this balance of power would produce outcomes that are not favorable to many powerful actors around the world. So the support for Mubarak or the regime, because Mubarak is no longer an issue now. Omar Suleiman, his vice president, is the issue, and the regime he oversees is the issue. It's a different case, and we will get to that point. But Jaworski's point about the illegitimacy not being sufficient is very important, and it's part of the reason why it wasn't enough that these dictators were not popular. The alternative was always considered differentially by various swaths of the population. The second factor is the elite capture of economic and political centers of power in the past 30 years in many of these Arab countries, which led to profound social polarization, not just in terms of haves and have-nots, rich and poor, but a complete detachment from almost two different cultures. Not cultures in the sense of culture talk, but different modes and ways of living between a very select few, and in the case of Egypt, about 60 to 70 million people who are deprived of most, if not all, the benefits of the liberalization that has been taking place in the past 30 years. And we talked about this extensively in the inequity panel yesterday. The benefits were captured by the winners. The winners were needed to replace labor and other populist groups as the allies of the regimes in the past 20 years, as the world moved from a bipolar world in the pre-Soviet Union collapse to a unipolar world in the post-Soviet Union collapse, where new liberalist policies of economic reform and change were dominant, and where there was a coincidence or an overlap of interest between elites in these authoritarian states and international financial institutions and their patron countries. So elite capture was either blessed or left alone. And that worked for a while until it reached levels, and I cannot calculate these levels. By the way, all political scientists affirm that you cannot predict a revolution. There's a reason why you cannot predict a revolution. You cannot measure exactly what is going to produce at a given point a revolution. And that there are reasons for that. There are social scientific reasons. One, what instigates a revolution is different from what keeps it going. So the guy who was pushing the grocery cart in Egypt, in Tunisia, who burnt himself, he engaged in self-immolation, which really hurts, by the way, because you know what just yesterday I was telling my wife I was trying to touch the stove, and it hurt me so much because it was hot and I didn't know it was hot, and I felt like, oh my God, you know, I'm like, you know, grown, I mean not grown in height, but in age person, and I was like, oh my God, and I felt like a wimp. This guy burnt himself. This is the extent to which things became devastating. And interestingly, this guy who burnt himself is different than the other people who burned themselves across the Arab world as a result of the same issue. Because the other people had in mind what this guy did and wanted to actually make a point. This guy didn't want to make a point. The first guy who did it didn't want to make a point. He didn't hurt anybody else. He just wanted to disappear because his last means of subsistence was taken away because of a license issue by a decrepit, corrupt regime. So he just, and he was not a college graduate. A lot of the analysts and pundits in the United States and in the Arab world talked about how this is the revolution of the middle class. Because this guy was a college graduate and he was forced to do this. No, he was not a college graduate. I have no idea where they got this from. It was actually denied and fixed in terms of the narrative. Even the New York Times published that this was false. It wasn't a college graduate, but that's why many people identified with him. Oh, we academics, we identified with this guy. He's a college graduate. He couldn't find a job. Then he was pushing a grocery cart. And then they took it away and then he burnt himself because of his middle class values. No, he was a high school, barely a high school graduate who didn't have any higher education at all. He was just a decent man who was pressed and pushed so far that he ended up doing that. So when this actually happened, we began to see a number of people. Well, there's Facebook and Twitter, and people overemphasize the utility of these things. Yesterday at 6 o'clock, I know that's why I'm sick too. I gave a talk at Georgetown University on what is happening in the region, along with 3 other local scientists and historians, and it was on C-SPAN. It was live and it was like a huge audience, and we talked about these issues. We talked about, well, the question of people are sometimes more interested in the social media and its role in the revolution than the actual revolution and what's happening. Social media did play a role, but keep in mind that when Twitter and Facebook and the internet and cell phones were shut off in Egypt for a couple of days, that's when we had the largest number of people go to the streets. So yes, they did play a role, but you know, let's not focus on the things we know about, because we know how Twitter works. You know, you type something in and you hit tweet. So we know how it works. Facebook, you know, I like. Unlike. Be one of the first of your friends to like this. We know how it works. So we focus on it. It's actually significant, but it's not that significant. I mean, sorry, it is significant, but not as significant as we make it out to be. So what instigated the uprising in Tunisia started with the word of mouth about this, and then there was an Al Jazeera correspondent who actually picked up the story and started publicizing it, and of course it went on Al Jazeera, and it was, you know, tweeted and emailed. I don't know why I'm looking at you the whole time. No, not you. The former student. You have a welcoming face, although you look like an Islamist, but you have by the way, I promised myself not to shave until either the revolution is over. What's the other thing? I'm sick, I don't know what it is. Anyway, so what instigated the revolution or the protest was this act. But what kept it going is the fact that everyone identified with the conditions that led people of the sort to actually do what they did. Because after that, there were a lot of people who challenged the police and the army, many were shot early on, right? They were shot because of the calculus of that army officer, usually a male, but there were females also in Tunisia, army officers. As time went by, and as we reached a critical mass, or the K factor, for those of you who aren't, who have followed that kind of literature, the K factor is when you reach a critical mass, whereby you know if you go to the streets, you're going to be supported by a critical mass sufficient to actually protect you. Because otherwise, you pay a high price. In Syria today, one of the most hardline authoritarian regimes in the region, and let's face it, it's actually the case after with Tunisia and Iraq before the 2003. If you go to the streets to call for the resignation of the president, that'll be the last call you make. Okay, and so the calculus is that's not smart, so you don't do it. But when you reach a certain level, people actually will join. And in Tunisia, after these sets of events and the violence of the regime in response, because the regime wasn't like the regime in Egypt, it had no confidence. To the extent that you have no confidence and no legitimacy, you use power. And the moment that became the issue, whereby the regime was was actually using violence against protesters, it increased and broadened the protest. So elite capture produced this polarization in various ways that created a situation where most of the public, the masses, belong to that lower common denominator of the disenfranchised, the disadvantaged, and so on. And that created an impetus for a mass collective action that is not organized and not part of any particular party. For several days, we were watching. Not one person out of hundreds of people being interviewed, not one person said anything other than we need dignity, we need opportunities, we need to be able to buy food for our family, and we need to be able to speak our minds freely. Not one person in Tunisia mentioned anything about culture, about Islam, about Muhammad, about Jesus, about Moses, about God, or about anything of the sort, in terms of talking about why they're in the damn streets fighting bullets. Yet, that's not important, right? It's not important in the way we look at things. And it's important to get beyond this impediment in order to find out why these people are doing this. 3, the absence of meaningful avenues to express discontent. Authoritarian regimes prohibit the expression of views that counter their, basically their line, their political line. And you cannot actually express discontent except through channels that are already prepared and established by the government. These are rubber stamp parties. So the last election in Egypt was a great example of how that was the last straw in November that broke the camel's back in Egypt. The last elections in 2010, November 2010 in Egypt, most of the opposition parties knew the elections were going to be rigged because the Egyptian regime feared repeating the 2005 elections, where a good deal of the opposition won a lot of seats. The Muslim Brotherhood won a lot of seats, despite them rigging the elections in various ways and discouraging voters. They did not want to repeat that. International power players were okay with that. We spoke out against it, but we also are afraid of a change of regime in Egypt. So it was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. It's almost as big as a camel, that straw. So that absence of meaningful avenues to express discontent, coupled with increased coercion and arbitrary violence by the state's coercive apparatuses, was a third factor. If you follow the news in the past 2 years, the police and the army and the secret service and the Republican Guard in Egypt and Tunisia and the rest of the Arab world, but in Egypt and Tunisia in particular, we have cases of people being brutalized just arbitrarily because these regimes have become decrepit. True, they're fierce and they're violent, but they lost control. In many ways, because of demographic pressures and so on, they lost control. And fiefdoms and centers of powers would be established in various parts of the country that would actually take on citizens in a manner that was extremely violent, coercive, brutal. And those things were captured. And they were like all over Facebook, all over YouTube. They were publicized everywhere, and people began to see what these regimes are doing in far and remote areas. That, coupled with the absence of a legitimate way to speak out, at the same time that you're not economically happy, creates a fertile ground for revolt. Still not enough, because I can't tell you what is enough, because these conditions already, for instance, exist in Yemen. But this is not happening. I can't explain it. Believe it or not, social scientists cannot explain everything. So I can't explain why it's happening here and not there in a way that is completely waterproof. Waterproof? Watertight? Age-tight?
Airtight.
Airtight. Okay, so but it's very important to recognize that this absence of meaningful avenues to express discontent, coupled with arbitrary violence, reached a point where the three areas that you can actually breathe were disappeared: politics, economics, and society. In Saudi Arabia and many oil-rich countries, the first applies. There's no alternative way to express discontent, right? But economically, despite increasing number of the poor and disadvantaged in these countries since the drop of the oil prices in the 80s, there is sufficient resources and sufficient distributive power within the state to keep things at a level whereby you're pissed off politically, your dignity is trampled on here and there in various areas, but you're surviving. You're sending your kids to school, you're surviving. But when you get to a point where all avenues are closed, and when this happens to a broad swath of the population, and when it's not regionally based only, when it applies to the countryside and the metropolitan cities, and when the leadership has less support regionally and internationally, yes, triggers can lead to something, which takes us to the last point, which explains, in part, why Egypt is different than Tunisia. Okay? And the last point is the lack of domestic and nationalist legitimacy of the regimes in question, as they are viewed as dependent on or responsive to external players. This factor becomes important later. It doesn't move people to action. People in Saudi Arabia don't say that the US guarantees our legitimate monarchy, so I'm going to go to the streets, right? This fact, or the same thing in Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco and actually everywhere in the Arab world now. After the fall of Iraq, because between 91 and after, Iraq was not in our camp anymore. Libya, in the past few years, also dropped its opposition to Europe and to the West, because, as I tell you in my class, Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator, destroyed his two chemistry sets in his basement, which means he destroys the nuclear WMD program, and he was good, and he paid off the people from the from the airline that he actually asked, gently to bomb. But he paid off the Europeans, and now he's a model, as George Bush said. He's a model for somebody who's towing the line, dropping WMD programs, and so on. So only Syria is left, by the way, as an Arab country that's firmly not in the US orbit. However, let's go back to number 4 and the lack of domestic and national legitimacy. Both Tunisia and Egypt, along with many other groups and regimes in the region, are viewed to have very little nationalist credentials because they have done a couple of things. First, they toe the line of external powers, and they are supported financially or militarily, economically, and so on by external and politically by external powers. That reduces the legitimacy. It doesn't play a role until actually something of the sort happens. It doesn't in and of itself play a role. However, because of Egypt's geostrategic importance, the messages that the Egyptian regime has been getting, and there are great articles about this. I don't want to toot my horn or our horn at the magazine, but we started an online electronic magazine precisely for the purpose that I'm trying to discuss right now, because the literature on the Middle East, not in journals and books, that's good, but when you realize how many people read books and journals, you're like, whoa. You write an excellent article in a great journal, and a few hundred people read it, which is great, or maybe a couple of thousand, right? But then these blogs on the Middle East, and there are many of them, they're read by tens of thousands, if not millions of people. But sometimes one post is read by 2 million people. It's really amazing. So, so a group of academics in Middle East Studies put together this, this online journal. It's called Jadaliya. And on it, you'll find chronicles of things of the sort. So if you look at the response of external powers to what's happening in Egypt, vis-a-vis what happened in Tunisia, you begin to realize that the support for the Egyptian regime, not Mubarak necessarily, is overwhelming. Contrast that with the 1989 events in Eastern Europe, when people on the streets, maybe in smaller numbers in some areas, and those of you who know more about Eastern Europe can share more. Contrast that with those events where we stood firmly with the protesters in an unequivocal way in some cases. This is absent in the case of Egypt. Until today, before I came right now, I was watching how in Suhaj, countryside of Egypt, 120,000 people strong demonstration led by 2 women, shouting slogans that are fantastic, poetically fantastic, just beautiful, with lots of power and lots of fortitude, right? Until right now, and it's about 8 o'clock or something in Egypt, in the countryside, right? It was such a moving picture. And that is coupled with, or accompanied by many other examples in many other cities, in the metropolitan areas or the rural countryside, with basically amounting to millions of people 2 weeks into the protest. And we will not, and the international community, forget about we, the international community, those with power, are not supporting the democratic, basically the democratist movement in Egypt of people, human beings, men and women, mostly young, who want dignity and to be heard without being punished or shot or killed or disappeared. We still have not done that. So number 4, the 4th element is crucial. Some people, what I call the Arab apologists, emphasize this and forget everything else. And I think this is really problematic. I put that person in the same camp as I do the culturalists and the culture talk people. Because not all problems in the Arab world are caused by the outside. That's why I put it as number 4. Because these people were not waiting for somebody from the outside to tell them to revolt. They're revolting, and they're going to get things done one way or another. But number 4 is important in preventing the regime from latching onto other things in order to stay in power. Kind of like the Kuwaiti regime or monarchy that's also authoritarian, also somewhat misogynist, also more misogynist than Egypt, that's for sure, and so on. In 1990, we sent 400,000 young men and women, American men and women, to restore that kind of regime because of, interest. So in Egypt, and the interest there was oil. Here it was geostrategic. And that does explain the nature of the situation today. All these factors combined help us. I mean, we need to research further in every one of them to explain why is it that Tunisia felt like this, because nobody's Ali. But Mubarak, supported by the American intelligence, European intelligence services, and of course political leaderships, and Israeli intelligence services. There's a lot of interest. The other factor that played a role in supporting Mubarak are the conservative Arab regimes, basically all Arab dictatorships minus Syria, played a role in supporting Mubarak, because if Mubarak falls and if Egypt falls, the Arab world will be a different place. The relationship between Israel and Egypt will change. The relationship between oil-rich countries and the rest of the Arab world will change. It's very important, it's extremely important for the Egyptian Mubarak dictatorship not to fall for 4 players: the United States, Israel, Arab dictatorships, and guess what? The Egyptian regime and its cronies. And these players are standing firm against the dismantling of the Egyptian regime in ways that didn't exist in Tunisia. The 5th element is the fact that Egypt did have some sort of a thriving civil society, many of which were really independent, but some were pro-regime. They just feared an alternative. They feared the Islamist alternative, not the Taliban alternative, but the Islamist alternative. They feared chaos, or they feared a change in the social order. which would put their wealth at risk. And these included Islamists, by the way. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is a middle-class movement. It's not a working-class movement, and it's not as broad-based as people think. Especially the leadership is conscientiously a middle-class movement. So it's not that the Islamists want a change in the social order. They would like to have, more Islamist elements in the polity, but it's not a movement that wants a change in the social order like some other Islamist groups that are not quote-unquote jihadists, whatever that word means. So these elements help us explain the good deal of what's happening, and it's important to actually unpack them. It's important to actually check the veracity of the things that are being said about them, including what I said. But we cannot understand the situation without looking at these elements. What's happening now on the ground is that after 2 weeks, we still have millions of people in Tahrir Square, in Alexandria, Suez, Dumyat, Asyut, Damanhur, Suhaj, protesting every single day in very large numbers. And it's fascinating how the demands of these people are all demands that if you take out the language and you take out, like you see the person who looks like me maybe, or a woman with or without a veil, if you take out these things, the demands are things that we all believe in. And this is not like a campaign where let's put this guy in the front or let's put this gal in the front. It's ubiquitous. And that's what's important. That's why we need to support people like you. There are actually people like you, your age, many of them. Have you seen the pictures? I mean, it's overwhelming how this movement deserves our support, and it's important that we recognize why it's not being supported internationally and regionally. And it's important for us to start pushing for that, because for too many decades, we've supported the exact thing that we profess is problematic, which is dictatorship and lack of political freedoms. And it's time, I think, that we begin thinking of the region in ways that are more productive for us in the long run. Us as frankly, as Americans. But that's not the only reason. As human beings, we should support these movements. But even if you want to go with the interest approach, because there are many realists right now who are changing their views. And they're beginning to say, history is not on our side. So it's intelligent and rational to begin switching things. This is not the time to stick to age-old policies simply because this is what has been the legacy. It's time to begin shifting. But people these guys are not in the middle of the centers of power today. So if you read people like Stephen Walt on foreignpolicy.com, it's important to read realists like Stephen Walt, who teaches at Harvard. It's a great way to begin seeing where things are likely to move. It might fall short of some people's expectations, but this is the line that I think will be responded to, because one always hopes that our democratic mechanisms, which I think always do at some level, at some point in the United States, will kick in order to reflect a broad view. But unfortunately, the media is not doing its job, and don't get me started on the media. We'll show you a couple of clips, and then we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. I apparently apologize because I think I lied. I talked more than I wanted to. I had little notes, and I thought that will, but I apologize about that.
What about Al Jazeera? Do you think Al Jazeera's reporting has been fair?
Sorry?
Does Al Jazeera's reporting been fair, do you think?
Al Jazeera's reporting is not fair, and it's not unfair. Al Jazeera has cameras all over Egypt, and they tell you what's happening. So it's, in that sense, the leadership of Al Jazeera is trying to show you what's happening. The editorializing is instigating or pushing the protesters' demands. If that's unfair, then yeah, that's unfair. As we finish this, let me just quickly read you the April 6th demands, April 6th movement demands of people in Egypt. The youth of Egypt have stood their ground. That's their list of demands. That is actually one of the most important statements that came out that has a lot of legitimacy. So there are many other statements, but we published this one in particular on the main page because it's actually has broad support. The youth of Egypt have stood their ground and struggled against the tyrant. We have faced bullets against bare chests with great courage and patience. We salute the great Egyptian people, the creators of this revolution. For that reason, we affirm that victory is the fall of Mubarak and his regime. Since the 25th of January, the Egyptian uprising, we have toppled the legitimacy of the dictator. Egypt is now ruled by the valiant Egyptian people. To protect the peaceful and glorious uprising, let us continue to protect ourselves and our Egyptian assets against the destruction and thuggery of the terrorist regime. We will complete that what we started on the 25th of January. We, the Egyptian youth, will not be deceived by Mubarak's talk, which aimed to manipulate the emotions of the Egyptian people and underestimate their intelligence, as he has become accustomed to doing for 30 years. Mubarak resorted to this misleading talk, thinking that Egyptian people could be deceived once more. To all Egyptians who love their homeland, we are your children, your sons, your daughters, and we represent your demands and that which we have all suffered under Mubarak's rule. Mubarak pretends to fully comply with the demands of the Egyptian people, but you must understand that this is merely a maneuver by the regime to deceive the free Egyptian people who refuse to go back to their homes and end their protests. Whoever among us examines the events that have transpired in the last few days with a conscious mind, beginning with the Friday's Day of Rage, will clearly realize that the Egyptian regime implemented an evil plan to keep Mubarak in power and is the desire of those elements within the regime who want to protect their own personal security. Notice how, first of all, we translated this. Notice how, so far, there's no mention of anything outside Egypt. This is not a response to, this is a domestic thing. I'll skip to the demands. We, the youth of the April 6th movement, which is the date when a lot of these protests started some time ago, announced our rejection of Omar Suleiman, the vice president, which is our man today, and Egypt's man and the Arab regime's man in Egypt. He's the vice president who's likely to take over. He was the head CIA chief, or what he's called actually, he's labeled the torturer in chief. There can be no dialogue until the departure of President Mubarak. We insist that we intend to proceed with what we started on January 25th to restore the rights that the Mubarak regime has robbed us of during this 30 years reign. We announce from Tahrir Square the following. These are the demands, and then we'll do the video. Are we ready? Okay. We will preserve until our demands are fulfilled. We will persevere until our demands are fulfilled. Namely, Mubarak should step down from power immediately, dissolving the National Assembly and the Senate, establish a national salvation group that includes all public and political personalities, intellectuals, constitutional and legal experts, and representatives of youth groups who called for the demonstrations on the 25th and the 28th of January. This group is to be commissioned to form a transitional coalition government that is mandated to govern the country during a transitional period. The group should also form a transitional presidential council until the next presidential elections. So they are accounting for the caveats that might be taken advantage of by the regime. Drafting a new constitution that guarantees the principles of freedom and social justice. Persecute those responsible for the killing of hundreds of martyrs in Tahrir Square, which is actually going to be a big issue, whatever ends up happening. The immediate release of all detainees. These demands are agreed upon by all the youth groups that have called for the January 25th and 28th demonstrations. We also announced that there is not any coordination between us and what is known as the Committee of Wise Men, because there was a Committee of Wise Men that was established, which sounds problematic, pompous, sexist, and what have you. And these are people that were not with the regime, but this is not the solution. These kids know that the answer is not a Committee of Wise Men, which shows you the eloquence of the protesters and who they are. A Committee of Wise Men is to replace the Mubarak regime? Hell no. Who have suggested ending the demonstrations and beginning negotiations with the Mubarak is still in power, so they oppose that. So this is a statement that you can see on jadaliya.com, Jadaliyya, and you can see lots of other literature on what's happening on the ground and what's happening within the halls of power. So I'll leave you with the...
One final point about the demands. They have a sign hanging up in Tahrir Square with all their list of demands kind of central to where they have a makeshift stage. And they kind of have an open mic where people can go up and address the people.
Exactly, and they have it on buildings as well. It's really fascinating.
Okay.
It's very bad for my government. I haven't food, I haven't anything. me and my children. I will die today. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're an atheist, you will demand your goddamn rights, and we will have our rights, one way or the other. We will never be silent.
Video became really famous right around the time that internet was cut off over there, and it was made by a guy named Tamer Shabbat.
There's also a number of rap videos which are made by artists in the United States and Egypt put together that are really